Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on this session on powering sustainability through renewable energy finance. My name is Pavina, and I will be the moderator for this session. Just by way of quick background, I previously worked in the Asia Pacific region on financing large-scale renewables with Siemens Financial Services, and most recently was working on bringing innovative technologies to market from a clean tech perspective in Australia with Iberdrola, a global renewable energy producer. I'm very excited to be here on this panel, and we know that island nations are at the forefront of climate change impacts. Rising sea levels, coastal erosion, and storm surges are just a few of the increasing stresses that the island nations face. As a result, these markets are seeing that the foundations of their economies and way of life are being washed away, all the way from agriculture to aquaculture to tourism. And we're seeing a lot of momentum around climate finance from global partners like multilateral institutions, donor countries, and the private sector that can play a critical role in helping to build resilience in these markets. Today, I've got an esteemed set of colleagues joining me here today. I've got Jorge Rodriguez de Almeida, financing expert for clean energy for EU Island Secretariat, followed by Cindy Cisneros Tianco, Principal Energy Specialist at the Asian Development Bank. Finally, none other than Jean Nicolai, Director of Energy at the Government of Bermuda. Before we kick it off, I'll pass it on to Jorge to introduce himself, followed by Cindy and Jean.
Hello, good morning. I'm from Portugal, so it's morning at the moment. So it's very nice to be here. So introducing myself, my name is George. I represent the Clean Energy for You Islands. It's an initiative from the European Commission. My background, I'm an electrical engineer, and I have been working on consultancy, especially on financing and sustainable finance for the last 20 years. So I'm very glad to be here and share some of my knowledge.
Great. Cindy.
Good evening from Manila. My name is Cindy Cisneros Tianco. I've been working at the Asian Development Bank for the last 13 years. Before that, I was a consultant and worked particularly in the Southeast Asia region. But now in ADB, I have been working in the Central and West Asia, and then followed by the Pacific region. So I'm across all the member countries of ADB and working on renewables in particular. I have a master's and PhD in renewables. So happy to be and honored to be part of this panel. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm calling in from Bermuda, so it's very early morning with us. I'm just getting my coffee. So I come to the energy sector through architecture. That's where my training was. So I'm very interested in building technologies and energy conservation and efficiency, and that's how I kind of worked into this sector. So that's where I have my master's degree in architecture. I've been the director of energy for the government of Bermuda since 2009. And in that time, we've developed energy policy, electricity legislation. None of that existed before my tenure. And in fact, I'm the first director of energy in Bermuda. We didn't even have a Department of Energy before 2008. So it's all been a very rapid evolution for us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jean. We'll kick it off with a few opening comments from George.
Okay, thank you. So I will share my screen. Let me just share it here because it makes it easier for me. Could you confirm that you are seeing the screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, so what I will talk about is the Clean Energy for You Islands. And what is the Clean Energy for You Islands and the Secretariat? So this is, it was set up by the European Commission because we understand that islands have more issues when it comes to financing their projects. And they are, as I mentioned before, at the front line of climate change. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done. This secretariat was set up some years ago. It had 3 phases. We are now on phase 3. First phase was to set up the scene. Second phase were more on the report, saying what can be done, the CITAs, what we call the energy transition agendas for the islands. But the third phase is more on the realization. So that is to provide technical assistance to all the islands, or 30 islands that have been selected, to make sure that they are 100% renewable by 2030, or at least to walk that path with them. And that's what brings me here, is also to develop this pipeline of bankable projects, so financing schemes for those islands. So this is a consortium that is on the back of it from different countries in Europe, but we are also supported by regional partners. This is very, very relevant, having in the island someone that knows the same language and has the same problem. So this is a part of the technical assistance. So the islands that have been selected, these 30 islands, they are not just 30 islands, they are islands or group of islands. I saw, for instance, on the chat that Madeira and the Açores were here from Portugal. So these 2 islands or group of islands have been also selected, and you can see that we have a bit across Europe, different islands that have been selected on this road. So what are the main trends for the technical assistance? We open the call and say, okay, you want to get climate 100% renewable. What do you need on support? So the topics were energy efficiency, electrification of land transport, stakeholder engagement, so key point also, marine transport, also on the electrification and sustainability, and hybrid power plants. A lot of questions about solar combined with wind. But also we need to support them not on the technology part, but also on the financing part. So we have, and I can talk about later on, a set of support to give to these islands on the financial, on the regular barriers, and even on the capacity buildings. And the last slide, I would just like to invite you all to join us in Pantelleria in May, where we will have our forum, and we will be discussing these topics with islands, for islands. So you are all welcome to join. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. It sounds like there's an incredible amount of work that the Clean Energy for UE Islands and the EU Secretariat is currently carrying out. Financing seems to be a common theme and a common thread that keeps coming up in discussions on what the barriers to scaling up renewable energy technologies in the islands are. We'll move over to Cindy from the Asian Development Bank just to hear some comments around what are the different approaches that multilateral institutions are introducing and innovative approaches to help tackle to help build climate resilience in these markets. Cindy, passing it over to you.
Yes, thanks, Pavina. Indeed, ADB has 14 member countries in the Pacific, plus several others in other parts of the region that are classified as small island developing states. But what they want to call themselves actually is big ocean states, or the BOS, because they do have among the largest exclusive economic zones. And ADB is now leveraging on that asset, which is a huge untapped source for renewable energy for the small island developing states, or the BOSes. So ADB is looking at particularly new technologies on say floating PV or ocean technologies, marine renewables, and using that to fuel productive uses of energy to also help develop or make the islands resilient to the climate change impacts, and also including adaptation elements into our projects. So the way we finance, we of course like to de-risk private sector investments by using and leveraging grant financing for for some of the elements that will not provide revenues for the private sector. And this is where some of our projects are now what we call introducing cross-sectoral integrated solutions, meaning we're not only focusing on the electricity output of renewable energy generation projects, but using that to provide additional benefits for increasing livelihood or increasing resilience. And among these elements we are introducing are like electric reefs or addressing health issues by producing electricity for hospitals and uninterruptible power supply for hospitals, for example, and also for clean mobility, like using electric vehicles or electric boats, particularly for these island states. So we do have several approaches that we are using now. And one of them is using grant financing to build batteries, and then having private sector build the generation capacity, because that is where the revenue comes from. Another approach we're doing is aggregation, and we are doing what we call regional procurement now, having several projects procured jointly. So we get the economies of scale. So for example, you have a 1 megawatt floating PV project in Tuvalu and a 5 megawatt project in Kiribati. You will then have the economies of scale because it makes it attractive for contractors and private sector in the end to finance these projects when we go for the future projects after these pilot that we are doing in Kiribati and Tuvalu. So that is just an example of what we're doing for the islands.
Thank you, Cindy, and for shedding light on the work around financing mechanisms that you're introducing to help drive renewable and decarbonization technologies. I think there's a lot of work that obviously the ADB is doing around providing technical assistance to these markets, to these island nation states as well. One of the more important elements that we haven't touched upon is the enabling environment in these markets, particularly to promote private sector investment and to crowd in private sector capital into these type of projects. Jean, we'd love to hear more about your thoughts and your experience having introduced legislations in Bermuda to help support private sector investment in renewable energy.
Thank you, Pavina. And again, it's such an honor to be here. So thank you so much for having me. One of my favorite expressions is always the second mouse gets the cheese. So proceed, make haste slowly is what we've been doing for the past, I would say, decade and a bit at this point. We didn't come out of the gate saying, okay, this is what we need. This is the perfect environment. Instead, we said, okay, well, what do we need right now? And we have this very adaptive approach to it, where now we've been regulating electricity for the past 8 years, 7 or 8 years, and we're at the point where we see what's working, we see what isn't working, and we're about to launch a suite of amendments to the regulatory acts to better enable that environment. So some of the things that we started with in electricity regulation was a very protectionist environment, so that our utility was well shielded from threats. And by that I mean, in a small island, if too many people start going off grid, who's left holding the bag? But it's the people that can afford it least. So we wanted to avoid those sorts of scenarios and ensure that we had a healthy utility. We still want a healthy utility because they should be our partner going forward, not our adversary. And that's also been a certain shift. There's a large element in Bermuda of let's stick it to the man, and let's go off grid, and let's why do we need a utility? Well, that's great if you can afford it, as I was saying. So what we've evolved that to, and where we started also was a very risk-averse environment, where if you were an innovator, forget about it. If you were nameplate number 1, you could not do business in Bermuda. You couldn't even hope to get in the door. So we started thinking about that, thinking, well, maybe that was a little short-sighted, particularly given our goals are to become, and I may be mistaken in this, but I think there was a public statement made that we wanted to be at zero emissions by 2050, or 100% renewable by 2050. That's probably more accurate. Whether or not we get there is another story, but we're certainly going to give it a good try. So one of the other things that we've done with our regulations is we started out with the regulatory authority, which is an independent self-funding organization. They're a quango, so they still have to report to government and answer to government, but they're not funded by government. Their decision-making processes are very independent. There can be no political interference in the actual decision itself. So the minister can't call up the regulator and say, hey, this is what I want you to decide, or I've got this, I've got this pet project I want you to have happen. It doesn't work like that in Bermuda. The other thing that happens is we have an integrated resource plan that is derived by the regulator and in consultation with the public. So our path forward reflects the will of the people. And the will of the people is very much toward renewables, which was really heartening to see that there were 3 scenarios presented in our last integrated resource plan. And the middle scenario, where we wanted a healthy amount of renewables at a slightly higher cost than if we did business as usual with fossil fuels. So that was very important to the people of Bermuda, and that was very heartening to see. So now we're thinking maybe we need to evolve that process of the integrated resource planning one step further. And maybe it's not about resource planning. Maybe it's not about fulfilling need, fulfilling demand, as it is to making that transition. So we're contemplating morphing that whole thing to an integrated transition plan. So these things are, like I said, we're making haste slowly. We're making those adjustments. And the other thing that we've done is we've introduced the innovative licensing regime. So in that, we are inviting technologies that are in beta testing phase to come to Bermuda, and there are some very strict requirements. So it's not the Wild West. We're still managing that risk, and Bermuda is known as one of the risk capitals of the world. We're better to manage risk how better to manage risk than to do it in this way, where we're very carefully analyzing those proposals that come in. And we've got our first innovative licensee coming in, and they're about to hopefully break seabed, and that's very exciting. So we're trying to look at all different ways we can get to that renewable energy goal of 100%.
That's very ambitious. That's a very ambitious target, Jean, and we're very excited to follow your work in Bermuda and see some of the developments that will be coming out over the next couple of years. You bring up a really important point. The phrase you used earlier was to ensure that you're keeping up with the will of the people. And a lot of times, I think social license, which is the concept of engaging with communities when you're developing large-scale renewable projects, is often overlooked. So I'd love to hear more about the work that George, you're doing at the EU Secretariat in terms of how you think about engaging local communities when developing large-scale renewable projects.
So that's a key point, exactly what you are mentioning. Not just for large scale, but even for smaller scale, and even for the strategy. So our thinking is that we need to engage with the local population from the early start of the process. So even when we develop this clean energy transition agenda, so this plan for decarbonization of the islands, we must involve the key stakeholders and must involve the population of the islands, because islands are very different from island to island. So you have islands with 100 people living there, or islands with thousands, or people living there with different resources, with different engagement. But from our experience, and we do have a partner in the consortium that manages and has good results on it. We need to engage with the population from early start, or else it's not easy to bring to the ground those projects. Also, we are seeing a trend that local population wants also to finance those projects, so they want to be engaged somehow, even in the finance of those projects. So they they like the ideas, and they are exploring ideas such as crowdfunding and other opportunities, so that they can even have a stake on that process, so they can be shareholders of their own projects and their own energy, and become really independent from outsource energy. So that's a trend that we are seeing, and a lot of islands have asked us to support them on that process, even on the energy efficiency. So they want to do energy efficiency on their building sector, but they want to be also part of the finance solution. Basically, they don't want to see the same banks all the time financing that and get all the profit. So they want to get a part of the process, and also being one of the investors, they have a say, they have a share, so they can have their opinion in the process also. So that's what we see and what we try to help them do.
And George, what are some of the financing models that have been introduced where communities can take a part in? What are some of the effective models that you've seen being deployed in these countries?
Okay, Samso Island is the most relevant example, because in the 90s they decided to become 100% renewable, and decided that this should be done by the local population. So they start these types of process. Back then, probably the name was not crowdfunding, so this is the name that we use now. But they just went to farmer, or to the people in the island, and decided to join or get some money, and then build the first wind turbine and start from the revenues from there. And now they own their electrical assets, or electrical production assets are owned by them. So they are a really good example of becoming neutral, and also having that in their own power. Of course, this is not cannot be just copy paste to all the islands, because it's not so simple. Not everyone has, for instance, the ability or the capacity to finance this. So it depends. The trend that we see now, it's the crowdfunding. So it's basically you can start from as low as $50 or 50 euros, and finance a small share of that project. And if a lot of people finance that project, you can get the money to do it. The key issue here, it's sometimes legal barriers. In theory, you can do this quite easily. In practice, sometimes it's not easy to develop the crowdfunding, depending where you are and how the legal setup is made for these types of funding.
That's a very interesting model, and you also addressed on an important aspect to renewable energy development in small island nations, which is capacity building. Cindy, we understand that the ADB has been quite critical in providing technical assistance to small island nation government in terms of how to set up the right policies to support investment, but also understanding of the technology and different financing mechanisms that have been successfully implemented in other markets. Could you talk a bit about some of the projects that you've been involved in, and where some of the jurisdictions have quite successfully scaled up technical assistance programs?
Yes, yeah, thank you, Pavina. Indeed, ADB has a whole host of technical assistance grants to the Pacific Island nations. And we are, of course, our vision is to become the region's climate bank, at the same time to support the very ambitious renewable energy targets of our countries, most of them actually have an ambition of close to 100% renewables within the next 5 to 10 years. And ADB is there to support them. So what we usually do is to do technical assistance that will not only help them with regulation, even developing the Energy Act, and also capacity building. So these two components are always part of any project that we are doing, including reforms, regulation, and capacity building, in addition to the infrastructure projects that we are financing. So among the modalities that we have introduced is what we call financial intermediary loans or financial intermediary grants. So what it does is that the ADB provides grant financing to the governments through a financial intermediary, and then they then on-lend it to households or small and medium enterprises for safe solar home systems or efficient appliances for them to also take part in achieving the renewable energy targets. For larger infrastructure where the utilities are our counterparts, we do have, as I mentioned earlier, some approaches where we use grant financing or public sector financing to fund the batteries and strengthen the grid. This gives comfort and de-risks the private sector to invest in the renewable energy generation capacity, largely solar PV we've done. And what we have found, the Pacific is like 11 countries, less than 2 million total population. So that's how small these markets are. And so that means, small markets, small investments, not very attractive to the private sector. At the same time, many of these countries actually don't have yet the enabling environment for private sector investments, in fact. So there's no private sector presence in at least 7 of these 14 countries that we work in. So we are now making sure that we develop the capacity, we develop the enabling environment for regulation and governance, of course. And ADB has also very strict ESG. We have very rigorous environmental safeguards and governance safeguards, which we always incorporate in all of our projects, whether it's public sector funding or private sector. And right now also we're introducing public-private partnerships into the models that we're using for the Pacific. Again, using public financing to leverage private sector to de-risk the private sector. So it could mean that, a small grant funding could be used for a long-term services agreement, or it can be used to fund O&M because operation and maintenance, because that's one of the key issues that the private sector face, where, and of course the governments face, because they're left with an asset that they're not able to, say, operate and maintain, and they don't have the funds to operate and maintain them. So this is why it's critical to introduce these elements that will make the projects not only technically feasible, but also sustainable from, through its economic life and make sense for the utility that's operating.
And Cindy, you mentioned enabling environment being a key barrier to private sector and particularly international private sector financing in decarbonization and renewable energy. What are some of the specific examples that you can point out where some people in the audience may be able to work on or provide their input on? What are some key specific examples that we need to focus on over the next decade to make renewable energy happen at scale in these islands? And I would like to really open it up to all three of you.
So I just wanted to say from Bermuda's perspective, we suffer from the same things that Cindy was talking about a moment ago, that we're small, we're a diverse region, different governmental structures, different, like we're a British overseas territory, so are Cayman and Turks and Caicos and Montserrat, etc. But we have counterparts like St. Lucia and Barbados and the Bahamas, and there's all different governmental structures there. So it's very difficult to achieve those economies of scale so that, you know, projects are affordable. And we tend to fall outside of development financing because of our high GDP. So I'm very intrigued by the approach that that Cindy's group is taking in the region with the aggregation of projects. And I'd be very interested to hear more about that, perhaps offline even. But I think that's a really important point to make, is that we aren't alone. We aren't, you know, we may be an isolated little island. I think we're one of the more isolated places on Earth, where the nearest landfall is 700 miles from us. So if we get it wrong in Bermuda, we get it really wrong. But we're not alone. We're not alone in terms of how we develop. You know, we can't plug into the island next door. We can't plug into the mainland because we're quite far away. So that makes us very risk averse, but at the same time, we need to find ways of achieving those synergies that will help us.
I mean, to add to that, thanks, Jean. Really, small islands have very, very common challenges, and some of them are felt more because of the particular context of a country. Several of our Pacific countries actually have an average elevation of less than 3 meters. So they're actually very vulnerable to sea level rise. So they're drowning in a way in the next decades or so. So that's something that we really need to look into. And when it comes to that, insurance becomes a big problem for the private sector to consider. At the same time, this is where we need to make sure that we have always a regional approach to our projects, and in designing them and in implementing them, and how we can aggregate and how we can make sure that we standardize and harmonize standards and codes for the energy sector. So apart from reforms that we are introducing, helping with legislation, we also look at grid codes and standardization and harmonizing technical specifications for projects. Make sure that, again, even the parts are also shall we say aggregated in a way that they can do procurement wholesale and get that economies of scale. So that's what we're trying to do. Everything integrated as well as regional, so that because many of the lessons will be very similar, whether it's a small country or a large country, they are looking at the same vulnerabilities. Yeah. I'll stop there.
I can just add that aggregation is key. We understand that projects that by themselves are not financed or they are not attractive from the private finance point of view, and there is not sufficient public money available to invest in all of these projects. So the only way to do it is aggregating different projects, and see them that all of those projects as one. But there is a key word for all of this, that is standardization. For aggregation, we need to standardize the approach, even have legal requirements that are similar. It's not, we will never have, if we go for different regions or different countries, even inside of the country, sometimes we will never have exactly the same legal environment, but at least has to be more or less aligned. If it's not, if it's very bureaucratic in one hand and the other not so much, so that can be an issue. But from the technical specifications to the tendering process, all of that has to be standardized as far as we can be. If that's the case, investors can look to a project that has a much higher ticket, so a much higher capex or a much higher investment, and understand that project as one, and sometimes even seeing the risks, not focusing on a specific risk of a specific project, but trying to look to overall risks, and that will bring them in a sense that the risks are lower than if they thought about a specific project. So I mentioned this offline, so it's easier to say than to do, so just to people understand. But that's a process that needs to be done from the beginning. Our recommendation is that whenever they start thinking about, I want to do renewables, I want to have a solar park or whatever I want to do, if an island close to mine is trying to do the same, let's come together and see whether we can bundle these projects. We should start thinking this at the beginning, because if you think about this at the later stage, it's hard for you to standardize to make sure that you fulfill all the requirements.
Absolutely, George. So what I'm hearing is that it's not the technology that's a risk or a problem. We know that utility scale solar or even solar at the distributed level is now proven technology in many parts of the world and has some of the lowest levelized cost of energy. So it almost feels like it's a no-brainer to install solar. Even onshore wind, we've seen gigawatts of onshore wind being deployed over the world. We're seeing electric vehicles now in many markets, electric vehicles entering mainstream markets, and we're seeing the cost of technology for batteries, solar PV, and wind turbine come down quite significantly. So the theme I'm hearing today is that it's no longer the technology that's the issue. We really need to solve the policy environment and the financing mechanism to allow for these projects to happen at scale. And aggregation and a portfolio model seems to be one approach to solving that problem. We've talked a lot about mitigation, right? And mitigation projects and how that can help small island nations in meeting their net zero targets. Something that we haven't addressed is adaptation. I mean, the UN estimates that the ocean trade is worth $3 trillion per year, right? And 5% of global GDP. What's called blue carbon ecosystems, such as mangroves, seagrasses, tidal and salt marshes, have potential to reduce 4 gigaton per year of carbon emissions by 2030 and 11 gigaton per year in 2050. And that's just one example of investing in nature-based solutions. Would love to hear more from my fellow panelists about what are the other different type of projects and climate solutions that we need to explore in small nation islands to help build resilience from a holistic perspective.
Well, I can talk about what we have in train and not so much about what we've done, because this is all very very new to us. So we were quite profoundly influenced, I would say, by hurricanes Irma and Maria. We saw what happened to our peers. In particular, it was quite profound what happened in Barbuda, where the entire island of Barbuda, as tiny as it is, had to be evacuated. There was not a single individual left living on that island after the hurricane. Everyone was removed. And it took a very long time. I think they're still in the process of rebuilding. Our neighbors in Puerto Rico have suffered tremendous losses because of Irma. And so going to regional energy conferences, we would hear these, for lack of a better word, these cowboys kind of popping up saying, we can restore the grid in 2 weeks in Barbuda, and the whole population can be back there. And I said, well, that's lovely that you can do that. However, who's going to be your off taker? You may have a functioning grid or a grid that could function, but when you don't have a single livable residence on that island, what difference does it make? And that's where I get very impassioned about the whole matter of resilience. So what we've started to do is regionally, we're developing scorecards for resiliency. We're developing kind of gap analyses so that we can see where our resilience challenges are and maybe do some preemptive work on those areas. We also have right now the Bermuda Ocean Prosperity Program that is in development. What we will wind up with through that program is a financing structure, hopefully, where projects can be financed. We're also looking at a marine spatial plan, because tiny Bermuda has 200 miles of a 200-mile radius of ocean around it, which is our exclusive economic zone. So we want to protect that. We want to make sure that it is exclusive. We do have interlopers coming in taking our fish. So we have to be careful about those things. But more to the point is we're trying to look at solutions that aren't just applicable to one sector, as Cindy was saying. We're trying to see where we can hit it on a few notes. So right now we have the innovator license that I was talking about a moment ago. A company called Sea-Based has come in, and what's kind of exciting about Sea-Based is there's no visual impact, which is great for Bermuda because we're a beauty spot. People love coming to Bermuda and looking at our incredible waters and the beautiful turquoise waters. You don't see anything on the surface of the water with the solution. It's all below. And what's particularly nice about that is that it creates an artificial reef as well. So we're looking at things that can hit on a few notes. So we're still in development with those things. So I'd say watch this space more than anything else, but we're acutely aware of resilience issues. And it's easy in Bermuda because we've had good building codes. So one of the things that we're working on is improving those building codes. Historically, we've had very robust construction. So right now, through the EU's Green Overseas project, we're getting funding to revise our building codes, to hire consultants that are necessary to do that, to ensure that they are contributing to resiliency, that they're robust, and also we're looking down the road at a building rating system so that occupants know what they're in for when they buy or rent a space in Bermuda. So that's good.
Wonderful, Jean. We're very excited to keep an eye on how the ocean energy project plans out. It sounds like a very innovative model, and yeah, it could definitely be a great use case for the other islands.
We're hoping.
Cindy and George, did you have any other comments to add from a adaptation perspective?
Yes, Pavina, I guess in ADB, we are, fortunate to have really good partners, regional partners in the Pacific. We have the Pacific Power Association as well as the Pacific Community, and that enables us to design regional technical assistance around all of these elements. We have the Pacific multi-donor Pacific Region Infrastructure Facility. It's a large DA funded by 7 donors. We have the Blue Pacific Financing Hub. We have the Healthy Oceans Initiative, about $5 billion in targets. We have the Ocean Resilience and Coastal Adaptation Trust Fund. So we have all of these trust funds and DAs that we can tap to use and leverage private sector financing, including for coastal adaptation, so that we de-risk, renewable energy generation. So among the other things that we are looking into are, capitalizing nature assets, payment for ecosystem services, and all that we are looking into right now. The key thing in the Pacific, of course, and small island states is that we all land constrained, right? So we need to, and there are competing uses of the land. So we need to make sure that we capitalize on the waters, on the oceans that they do have a lot of. So what ADB is trying to do now is what we call floating solar plus projects. That this is very close to my heart. This is a project I'm developing, or projects I'm developing now. One of them has already been approved in Tuvalu, another one in Kiribati coming. So with this floating solar plus productive uses of energy, that means including clean mobility, including electric boats, electric vehicles, and electric boats also for operation and maintenance of the floating PV plants. And electric reefs, what they are artificial reefs. They're powered by electricity, and it's generated by passing electricity through metal structures. And then you actually create coral by using that. So it is also a coastal protection measure, not only protecting the floating PV from the waves and currents and storms, but also the coast as well. But apart from that, we are introducing even additional adaptation elements like wave breakers, like sandbags and things like that, to make sure that we incorporate coastal protection in all of our projects, particularly this floating PV. And we are procuring them regionally. So that we get the economies of scale, we get the standardization, and we get all the elements, not only mitigation, but also adaptation. And by the way, ADB considers floating PV as an adaptive technology. So that makes it really, all encompassing in terms of our targets.
I don't have much to say apart from what has been said here, but just to mention that if you look as an investor for any assets that you are investing on, you have to think about the risks in the future. And climate change is a key risk at the moment. So that's a point that you need to address. Even if you think only about your investment perspective, if you take out your head of environmental head or whatever, if you think only about pure investment perspective, so there are key risks that you see, the debt of the country, whatever. So those all credit risks, so all of those risks. And one key risk at the moment for all the investors that we work with is the climate change. So the question is whether my asset will be there for the years that we need to be there to be paid or not. And whether a key question that Jean mentioned, whether we will have an off-taker, because you can have the asset, you can have the production, but if there is no off-taker, so there is no your business is not a good business. So so this is why when we think about mitigation projects, we always have to have in hand the part of adaptation. We must make sure that the island is ready for these impacts. Of course, hurricanes at the scale that has happened, so there is no measures that can, it's an impact that it's not very predictable. But still, for when we think about these projects, we really need to think what can happen and until what we can make resilience of this project and resilience to the island. So that's a key point. And I don't think that any investor would invest in any project without having this as a layer to be studied to make sure that things will move on. A second note is that a lot of banks are developing specific lines for adaptation. But since the business model is not so clear as mitigation, because in mitigation we produce energy, so it's easy to understand the business model. When it comes to adaptation, if we talk to insurance companies, they understand the business model. But apart from that, it's not easy to develop a business model. And so those lines are not easy to deploy because they are really new and they come from other KPIs that usually banks or financial institutions are not so used to work with. So this is a process that has to be done, and I think that it's on the right direction.
Thank you, George and Cindy. What I'm hearing is that with regards to mitigation and renewable energy projects, we know what the business model is, and there are precedents in other jurisdictions that have been successfully raised project debt. A lot of times you would need, there is a buyer at the end of the project through an offtake agreement, long-term, either with a utility or with the private sector. And what we are understanding is that today is that there's still a long way to go in terms of what are the different offtake models that we can develop for adaptation projects. We'll have to wait and see on how things develop, but conscious of time, I'd like to open it up to the floor to take a few questions coming in from the audience. We've got one very exciting question coming in from Nimrod Tau Fusion Power, which is, what is the vision, the island's vision for small nuclear power, future fission SMR or fusion systems? Also interested to understand the investment perspective from the ADB and the EU Secretariat's perspective.
Okay. To be honest, we don't have a common approach to that from the Secretariat. So I don't know, I cannot speak in the name of the Secretariat or the European Commission. What I know is that the European Commission is developing this taxonomy. And under the EU taxonomy, there are certain activities that are considered sustainable and other activities that are not considered sustainable. And so the European Commission basically is saying what activities can be financed, for instance, through grants and which cannot be financed through grants. And this is moving also to the banks and to the financing industry, because the ratio of capital that is used when you finance a known compliant with the taxonomy project is much higher than when you finance a compliance with the taxonomy project. So this will also lead banks to finance projects that are aligned with the taxonomy. But for the specific case, what I would recommend is for him to check whether it's on the taxonomy or not, to understand the point of view of the Commission to the technology. Given that is a new technology, it might be on the gray area, so something that has to be further developed.
Great, thank you for that, George. Cindy, any perspective from the ADB on financing SMRs?
Very, very interesting question. And I think many, pockets of ADB is actually, of course, looking at, different technologies. But we do have a new energy policy. It was established in 2021 that, unfortunately, specifically will not, that looks at them as ineligible for ADB financing. So right now we are not able to look into SMRs. And maybe in the future we do another review of the energy policy. But I think we are owned by 68 member countries, so that is the position of the 68 owners of ADB.
Thank you, Nimrod. It looks like we're going to have to wait a while before SMRs are approved for financing in the islands, but no doubt there are some other exciting technologies that are coming to market in these islands. And to close out the session, are there any other questions from the audience? If not, I'm happy to ask one last question to wrap up. Right, looks like there are no other questions. Then we can maybe try to close out by looking forward into the future. The Pacific Islands are potentially geared up to host COP31 with Australia. I think there's been a lot of talks about that, which means that this is a very exciting next couple of years for the Pacific Islands and small island nation as a whole in terms of them being at the center stage and demanding for the type of financing that would be required to help build resilience in these markets. Looking forward to 2030, what are some of the important elements that we need to focus on in helping small nation islands build resilience, and what can the private sector do to help? Whether that be from a technology supply perspective or bringing in capital.
Well, I'm going to bang the drum for good, robust regulation again. That I can't underemphasize the value of that. So, just in an effort to work together, we're perfectly happy to share anything we've done with anyone who needs to know. But we have some lessons to learn too. So let's keep the dialogue going, I would say, and let's make sure that we have this robust network of small island countries who can share information and share experiences.
Thanks for that, Jean. That's we're definitely very excited to hear about all the lessons learned that you'll be able to share from Bermuda. Cindy, any thoughts from the ADB perspective and more from your experience working across different jurisdictions?
Yes, we really need to encourage private sector investments in renewables and in the energy sector in general. Public funding is very limited. Grant funding in particular is very limited, even from the governments as well as from our donor countries. So we need to be able to look at financing arrangements with the public and private sector combined, so that it's a win-win situation for both. This is where we also assist in developing bankable power purchase agreements, making sure that there is no party that is being disadvantaged in that arrangement. So in fact, we are proud of the Tonga PPA that we did for the first IPP, and we believe that is a very robust PPA. So that is one thing that we are looking to replicate in many of our projects in the future. But really the key is for using grant and public financing better in a way that it will encourage more participation from the private sector, and for private sector to also get or at least absorb some of the risks. So there needs to be a proper risk allocation when it comes to projects with public and private financing. So I guess it's a conversation that really needs to happen. And there are still a lot of unknowns, particularly in small island countries that are battered by cyclones and things like that. So it is also very uncertain. So we need to also take care of all the other aspects around project development and project investments, like insurance, like standardization of equipment, like other counter guarantee for risks and things like that. We really need to design a robust project, not only from the technical point of view, but also from the financing and structure of the arrangements, financing arrangement.
Absolutely. With fiscal burden and cost of debt rising, I think you've brought up a really important point about the limitations on exclusively relying on public sector and multilateral financing for RE development in these nations, and where we need to focus on the next decade, as I'm hearing, is pushing together a robust enabling environment that will de-risk investment for private sector players and institutional investors that would be interested in investing in a portfolio of aggregated projects, as you've all pointed out today. George, any final comments and perspective from the EU Secretariat?
So I agree what has been said here by Cindy. So blended finance and sometimes use the grants for a risk-sharing facility and not use the grant for building up the asset. It's more important than use the grant for building up the asset, because the amount of grants that we have is very limited. So we need to use this in a very smart way so that we can leverage from that, make sure that we divide the risks, and make sure that from the private perspective, it's a really interesting project that they are financing. And for that, we need to be very smart in the way that we allocate public money. Which sometimes we respond very quickly to political decisions or to political movements, and sometimes the money cannot be fought as at this level. But that's the way to move forward, and that's something that we all need to think when we develop our projects, is how to use grants together with private money, and how we make sure that we distribute the risks in the best way possible, because there are risks that must be taken by the private sector, and there are risks that could be taken or must be taken by the public sector, for instance.
Absolutely. I think risk allocation and risk mitigation is an important part of project financing for renewables. Thank you so much, my fellow panelists, George, Cindy, and Jean, for the amazing work that you're doing to help island nations progress in their net zero pathway. And we look forward to hearing more about your work over the next couple of years. I'd like to thank the EU Island Secretariat, the Government of Bermuda, and the Asian Development Bank for the representation today. And thank you to the Island Innovation team for putting this together. Thank you, everyone.